Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. Liam Carter had long stopped counting the cracks that ran along the wooden walls of their small crumbling house at the edge of Aldermont. Every day when he woke up, the same ceiling with its water stains and spider webs greeted him, a tired reminder of the life he had grown to despise. He wore his poverty like a second skin, a bitter robe that chafed at him with every passing day. His heart had hardened over the years, growing calluses so thick that even Amelia's soft smiles could not reach him anymore. She would still hum under her breath while fetching water from the stream, her laughter occasionally breaking through the heavy silence that clung to their home like an unwanted guest. Liam watched her sometimes from a distance, an emotion he refused to name stirring faintly in him, but just as quickly resentment would flood back, wiping away any trace of tenderness. In his eyes, dreams were for the rich, hope was a cruel trick played on the poor. Children to him were nothing but shackles forged by life to drag a man deeper into the swamp of helplessness. And so when Amelia, with her warm eyes and aching heart, dared to whisper her desire for a child, Liam slammed the door on her dreams with words as sharp as broken glass. They could barely feed themselves, he reminded her again and again. What foolishness it would be to bring another soul into their empty house, into a world that had nothing but suffering to offer. Amelia Carter often sat alone by the cracked window, watching the sun bleed orange across the dusty fields, her hands resting on the slight swell of her belly long before it truly began to grow. She prayed quietly, not daring to hope too loudly, for fear that her husband's scorn would hear even her silent longings. Liam had made his position clear. Children were not welcome in their broken world. Yet beneath the weight of her husband's bitterness, a stubborn flicker of hope refused to die inside her. She remembered the stories her mother once told her by firelight, tales of how the laughter of a child could heal even the deepest wounds. Maybe, just maybe, a baby's cry could weave back the threads that had come undone between her and Liam. Each evening she sewed tiny clothes in secret, stitching her dreams into every careful thread, hiding them beneath loose floorboards whenever Liam approached. Her body, however, began to betray her secret, and no amount of oversized dresses or quietness could disguise the life blooming within her. When the day came that she could no longer hide, she stood before Liam with trembling hands, her voice barely a whisper, hoping, praying, that somewhere behind the fortress of his anger a seed of joy might still exist. But when he looked at her, there was no light in his eyes, only a storm brewing, ready to tear apart the fragile hope she had so carefully built. The silence that fell between them after Amelia revealed her pregnancy was heavier than any words Liam could have shouted. It settled into the corners of the house, crept into their shared bed at night, and wrapped itself around Amelia's heart like icy vines. Liam, true to his word, withdrew even further, leaving Amelia to navigate her pregnancy alone. There were no gentle hands to ease her aching back, no warm voice to assure her that everything would be all right. Instead, there were long, lonely nights where Amelia whispered lullabies into the empty darkness, singing for the two tiny leaves growing inside her. She became familiar with hunger as Liam rationed their food even more tightly, blaming her swelling belly for every extra grain of rice that vanished. The villagers of Aldermont noticed, of course. They saw the way Liam's mouth twisted into a bitter line whenever someone mentioned the coming babies, saw the way Amelia shrank smaller each day, folding in on herself like a wounded bird. Yet in Aldermont, poverty was a language all its own, and sympathy was a luxury few could afford to give. The village carried on as always, while Amelia counted the days with growing dread, feeling as though she was preparing not for a joyful birth, but for some unspoken tragedy that lurked just beyond the horizon. It was on a night when the wind howled like mourning spirits through the cracked windows that Amelia's labor pains began. Alone and doubled over in the dimly lit room, she clutched the frayed blanket around her shoulders and stumbled toward the door, hoping, praying that someone, anyone, might hear her cries. It was the widow next door, Mrs. Evelyn Harper, who answered the desperate banging on her door. Mrs. Harper, who had buried her own children long ago, did not ask questions. She simply bundled Amelia into her arms and guided her back to the tiny house, her old hands steady and sure as they brought the twins into the world. Two fragile cries rose up into the night, two perfect, miraculous lives that neither their father nor the world had wanted. Amelia wept as she held them against her chest, their tiny hearts thudding like moth wings against her skin. For one fleeting moment, despite the cracked walls and the bitter winds outside, there was warmth in the Carter home. A warmth so pure, so bright it seemed even the ghosts of sorrow that haunted their lives had paused to marvel at it. But as Amelia rocked her newborns in the dark, she did not notice the shadow standing silently outside the door, its heart hard as iron, its mind already turning toward decisions that would shatter her world forever. When Amelia finally gathered the courage to tell Liam about the birth of the twins, the sun was barely peeking through the clouds, casting a pale light over their tiny home. She sat on the edge of the creaking bed, her heart hammering in her chest, the twins swaddled tightly in blankets beside her. Liam stood by the doorway, a dark silhouette framed against the weak morning light, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Amelia's voice trembled as she spoke, the words heavy with fear and fragile hope. She told him about their son with his tiny clenched fists and their daughter with her soft, searching eyes. She waited, holding her breath, for even a flicker of emotion to cross Liam's hardened face. But none came. Instead, he let out a low, humorless laugh, a sound so dry and bitter it seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. Without moving from his spot, Liam told her that she had brought not one but two burdens into their miserable lives. His words fell like stones, breaking what little remained of Amelia's battered spirit. She clutched the twins closer, shielding them from his gaze, as if her arms alone could protect them from the cruelty that hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Days melted into nights, and the house became a battleground of silence and suppressed despair. Amelia, still weak from birth, struggled to care for the twins, her every movement slow and deliberate, her body aching in places she didn't know could ache. She breastfed them when Liam wasn't looking, afraid he might see their hunger and twist it into another reason to despise them. Liam, for his part, refused to even acknowledge the baby's existence. He came and went as he pleased, spending hours wandering the village fields or sitting at the tavern, nursing cups of cheap ale with a few men in Eldermont who had given up on their dreams long ago. At home, he built walls of indifference so high that even the tiny cries of his newborn son and daughter could not climb them. Amelia watched him with a hollow ache growing inside her, mourning a man who was still alive but felt as distant as the stars. She sang to her babies in whispers, songs filled with sorrow and trembling hope, her lullabies barely disturbing the heavy stillness that blanketed their home. Outside, the seasons began to shift, but within the Carter household, time seemed frozen, trapped in a relentless cycle of cold glances and unspoken grief. The villagers of Aldermont noticed the twins, of course. News in small towns traveled faster than the river's current. Some women clucked their tongues with pity when they saw Amelia trudging down the dusty road, her babies bundled against her chest, their little faces peeking out with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Others turned their heads away, uncomfortable with the raw sadness that clung to her like a second skin. A few kind souls, like old Mrs. Evelyn Harper, would slip Amelia a loaf of bread or a handful of herbs for the baby's colic, but no one dared confront Liam. He had grown meaner, his bitterness curdling into something darker that even his neighbors feared to touch. Amelia bore the weight of their isolation in silence, her dreams of a joyful family life crumbling under the harsh reality of her existence. Sometimes she would sit by the stream outside the village, the twins asleep beside her, and watch the water rush over the rocks, imagining it carrying away her sorrows. In those stolen moments, she allowed herself to dream of another life, one where her babies were cherished, where Liam's face softened at their laughter, where her days were filled not with dread but with light. But as the sun dipped behind the hills and the shadows lengthened, reality would come rushing back, cold and merciless. The first real storm of the season arrived with little warning, turning the dusty paths of Aldermont into rivers of mud and sending sheets of rain slamming against the sagging roofs. That night, as Amelia sat by the fire rocking her daughter, Liam stood by the window, his face carved in stone, watching the rain without speaking. She could feel his restlessness crackling in the room like a gathering storm of its own. When he finally spoke, his words struck like lightning. He accused her of ruining his life, of trapping him with mouths he never asked to feed, of chaining him forever to a life of misery. Amelia tried to reason with him, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, but Liam's mind was a fortress against her pleas. He left in the dead of night, his footsteps swallowed by the rain, and didn't return until the sky had begun to pale with dawn. When he did, he reeked of wet earth and cheap whiskey, and there was a look in his eyes Amelia had never seen before, a look that chilled her blood. She held her twins closer that morning, a nameless fear gnawing her insides, sensing in her bones that something terrible was coming, something that no lullaby, no whispered prayer could ever undo. Liam's decision to rid himself of the twins was not made in a fit of anger but with the slow, calculated coldness of a man who had convinced himself that desperation justified cruelty. He sat for hours at the old tavern by the edge of Aldermont, nursing a chipped mug of ale, his mind turning in dark, relentless circles. It was there, under the dim glow of the oil lanterns, that he first heard whispers of Madame Henrietta Knox, the wealthy widow who lived beyond the stone bridge, alone in a grand house that was filled with every luxury but echoed with silence. They said she was desperate for children, that she had offered fortunes to those who might find her a child to call her own. Liam listened, his heart pounding a slow, heavy beat. That night he returned home soaked in rain and mud, his clothes clinging like second skin, and stared at the two small bundles lying beside the fire. Amelia slept curled protectively around them, a soft, weary sigh escaping her lips. For a fleeting moment, something old and almost forgotten stirred inside him, an ache he quickly crushed beneath the iron weight of his resolve. By dawn he had made his choice, sealing with the kind of grim determination that had once served him well in battles against hunger and hardship. Only this time he would be fighting against the fragile threads that tethered him to the innocence he believed he could no longer afford. The day he arranged the meeting with Madame Knox was thick with mist, the kind that clung to the skin and blurred the edges of the world into something strange and uncertain. Liam carried no pride with him as he approached her estate, only the heavy sack of guilt he refused to acknowledge. Madame Knox received him in a parlor lined with rich fags and heavy furniture, her eyes sharp and calculating behind a veil of carefully painted kindness. She listened without interruption as Liam stumbled through his rehearsed speech, presenting his betrayal not as desperation but as necessity. She agreed to the exchange without hesitation, her smile never reaching her eyes. The sum she offered was enough to buy Liam land, cattle, perhaps even respect in a village that had long ceased to look him in the eye. As he walked away from her house, a bundle of notes heavy in his pocket, he told himself it was for the best. He told himself that the twins would live in comfort, that Amelia would eventually understand, that the ache gnawing at his chest was only hunger, nothing more. He returned home that evening to find Amelia singing to the twins, her voice cracked and tired but filled with a sweetness that made Liam's stomach twist into knots. He said nothing, merely sat by the door, staring at the dirt floor, waiting for the cover of darkness to finish what he had started. When the house grew still, when Amelia's eyelids fluttered close from exhaustion and the twins' breathing became soft and rhythmic, Liam made his move. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow over the room that made everything look ghostly and unreal. He moved with careful steps, his boots silent against the worn wood of the floor. His hands trembled as he lifted the twins, one in each arm, feeling the fragile weight of them, the warmth of their tiny bodies pressing against his chest. For a moment he stood frozen, their small hands curling unconsciously against his shirt, trusting and unaware. His throat burned, but he swallowed the rising tide of doubt and slipped out into the night. The village slept around him, the narrow streets empty. They only sound the distant croak of frogs from the marshes. The path to Madame Knox's house was a long and winding one, and each step Liam took felt heavier than the last, as if the earth itself were trying to pull him back. By the time he reached her door, the first grey light of dawn had begun to seep into the sky. Madame Knox stood waiting, a dark figure against the flickering light of her porch lantern. She took the quince from him without ceremony, her arms practiced and firm. She handed him a small satchel, the promised payment, and without a word turned and disappeared into her house, the door closing with a soft, final click that sounded louder than any shout. Amelia's awakening was slow, confused at first by the strange quiet that hung in the house. She reached out instinctively for her babies, her arms finding only the rumpled blankets where their warm bodies should have been. A sick feeling unfurled in her stomach as she scrambled to her feet, her heart racing with a panic she couldn't name. She tore through the small house, calling their names though they had none yet, only nicknames whispered in the dark. When there was no answer but the echo of her own voice, she stumbled into the village square, barefoot and wild-eyed, clutching one of the tiny knitted caps she had made. The villagers watched from behind half-closed doors and shuttered windows, their faces marked by a heavy, uneasy silence. No one came to her aid, no one offered comfort. They knew or suspected, and their silence was an admission as much as it was an indictment. Amelia's cries pierced the morning air, raw and desperate, but there was no one left to hear them who dared to answer. She fell to her knees in the muddy street, the cap pressed against her chest, rocking back and forth as if she could will her babies back into her arms. Above her the sun rose, indifferent and cold, casting its light over a world that had allowed a mother's heart to be broken without so much as a whisper of protest. The morning after Amelia's cries tore through the village, Aldermont wore a strange, guilty silence. The streets, usually bustling with the sounds of traders and laughing children, felt heavy, as if the entire place was holding its breath. Amelia returned to the house, her body soaked in rain and mud, her bare feet trembling with each step. She moved like a ghost, her eyes vacant, her arms reaching out to grasp at memories that had already begun to slip through her fingers. Inside the house, nothing had changed. The fire still smoldered weakly in the hearth. Liam's boots sat by the door. The patched curtain fluttered gently in the breeze, but everything was wrong. She searched every corner of the small dwelling, overturning baskets, lifting the thin mattress, opening and closing the rickety cupboard as if her babies might somehow be hidden there, playing a cruel game of hide and seek. When reality finally crashed into her chest with the force of a hammer, she let out a sound that seemed too large for her small frame to contain, a low, broken wail that rose and fell, carrying with it the raw agony of a heart torn apart. She collapsed on the floor, curling into herself, the tiny cap clutched so tightly in her hand that the yarn cut into her skin, but she felt no pain greater than the emptiness inside her. Liam returned just before noon, walking up the muddy path with the casual gait of a man returning from a day's work, not a man returning from the betrayal of the woman who had loved him beyond reason. His face was unreadable, a blank canvas wiped clean of regret or remorse. Amelia sat rigid by the fire, the cap still in her lap, her face pale and streaked with dried tears. For a moment, the two simply stared at one another, the gulf between them stretching wider with every heartbeat. Liam shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable, but when he finally spoke, his words were like stones thrown into a fragile glass house. He told her bluntly that the twins were gone, given to someone who could afford to raise them, someone who could give them the life he never could. His voice held no tremor, no softness, only a brutal finality that shattered what was left of Amelia's spirit. She rose to her feet slowly, her legs trembling, and asked him one question. Why? Liam shrugged, as if the answer was obvious, as if love, sacrifice, and motherhood were luxuries he had long since abandoned. Amelia slapped him then, her small hand cracking against his cheek with a force born from strength but from heartbreak. Liam didn't flinch, didn't retaliate. He merely stared at her as though she were a stranger he no longer recognized. The hours that followed were a blur for Amelia. She wandered the village in a daze, seeking help, seeking answers, seeking anything that could undo the terrible wrong that had been done. At first, the villagers averted their eyes, unwilling to meet the shattered gaze of a mother bereft. But Amelia was relentless. She stood in the center of the marketplace, her voice shaking but clear, recounting what Liam had done to anyone who would listen. Slowly the tide began to turn. Whispers spread like wildfire, reaching even the ears of Mr. Graham Woods, the village constable, a man known for his stern sense of justice. When Amelia approached him, clutching the tiny cap like a badge of mourning, he listened without interrupting, his weathered face growing darker with every word. Without waiting for permission from the village elders, without consulting the local council, Mr. Woods summoned 2 guards and set off toward the Carter home. The villagers followed at a distance, a silent procession of shame and curiosity, watching as the sins of one man were dragged into the light. Liam saw them coming through the dusty window, and for the first time since the twins had been born, a flicker of fear crossed his face. Liam was arrested without ceremony, the clink of iron shackles around his wrists sounding louder than the murmured prayers of the villagers gathered to watch. He protested, of course, tried to spin his betrayal into an act of mercy, but no one believed him. The constable's grip was firm, and Liam's protest died on his lips as he was led through the village square, past the faces of neighbors he had known his whole life, now twisted in disgust and disbelief. Amelia stood at the front of the crowd, her face devoid of expression, the cap still clutched against her chest like a shield. Their eyes met one last time, and in that moment Liam saw something that shook him more deeply than any chain could. Not hatred, not even anger, but the hollow emptiness of a love that had been murdered. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Amelia turned away before he could utter a sound, walking slowly back toward her empty home, her steps measured and deliberate, each one a funeral march for the life she had once imagined, the family she had been forced to mourn while still drawing breath. The cell where Liam Carter was thrown was nothing more than a small stone room behind the constable's office, damp and dark, with a single narrow window too high to see through. The iron bars on the door creaked with every breath of wind, a sound that gnawed at Liam's nerves like tiny teeth. At first he raged. He shouted hoarse threats into the empty air, cursed the villagers who had turned on him, cursed Amelia for making him a villain in their eyes. He kicked at the walls, bruised his fists against the unyielding stones, but there was no one to hear and no one to care. The guards who brought him his food, thin porridge and stale bread, said nothing, only sliding the trays through a gap without meeting his gaze. As the days stretched into nights and the nights into an endless grey twilight, Liam's anger drained away, leaving only a heavy, aching silence in its place. He lay on the rough cot, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, and for the first time he heard it, the sound of tiny cries, thin and distant, echoing through the stone walls. He clamped his hands over his ears, squeezed his eyes shut, but the cries grew louder, weaving through his dreams, turning every moment of restless sleep into a fevered nightmare from which he could not wake. Amelia did not return to the constable's office after Liam's arrest, nor did she attend the brief hearing where the charges against him were formalized. She did not need to. Her part in the story was finished. Her voice no longer needed to condemn him. His actions had already spoken louder than any words ever could. Instead, she spent her days moving like a shadow through Eldermont, untouchable and silent. She returned to the house where the walls still bore the echoes of her baby's laughter, the house that smelled of old milk and sorrow, and packed what little she owned into a worn burlap sack. There was no ceremony to her leaving, no farewell whisper to the neighbors who watched her from behind curtains and doorways. Amelia simply slipped away one misty morning, the shawl her mother had given her wrapped tight around her shoulders, her feet carrying her away from a village that had been both cradle and grave to her dreams. She walked past the oak tree where she had once imagined telling bedtime stories, past the stream where she had once washed the tiny clothes she sewed in secret, past the marketplace where no one dared meet her eyes. She did not cry. Her grief had gone beyond tears, settling instead into a quiet, unmovable place inside her, a scar so deep it no longer bled. Inside the stone cell, Liam marked the passage of time not by the sun or the moon, but by the weight in his chest that grew heavier with each breath. The walls seemed to press closer with every passing hour, and the cries of the twins haunted him without mercy. Sometimes he thought he heard Amelia's voice too, soft and broken, singing the lullabies he used to ignore. He began to talk to himself in whispers, trying to justify what he had done, weaving lies so thin even he could see through them. He told himself it had been necessary, that he had saved Amelia from a life of drudgery, that he had given the twins a future free of want. But deep down, he knew these were the desperate defenses of a man who had lost his soul long before the shackles ever touched his wrists. On the rare occasions when the constable entered to check on him, Liam would sit up quickly, hope flickering in his eyes, only to wilt when no reprieve came. He thought often of Madame Knox's grand house, wondering whether the twins were treated like treasures or trophies. He wondered whether they would grow up hearing lies about the parents who had given them away, whether they would ever know the truth, whether they would feel a hollow ache they could not name whenever they passed a stranger on the road who looked just a little too familiar. The day Liam was released was not a day of freedom but a day of reckoning. The constable unlocked the cell without ceremony, tossing Liam a threadbare coat and a few coins charity, not mercy. There was no crowd waiting outside, no angry mob, no curious onlookers. The world had already moved on without him, and Eldamont had made his judgment in the language of silence. Liam shuffled through the empty streets, his body thinner, his shoulders stooped, his boots worn down to the soles. He went first to the house he had once called home, but it stood empty, the door swinging gently on its hinges, the room stripped bare of anything that ever mattered. He sat on the threshold for hours, staring into the nothingness, listening to the faint memory of Amelia's laughter, the faint patter of tiny feet that had never learned to walk there. As the sun dipped below the hills and the cold crept back into the village, Liam rose and wandered toward the outskirts of town. He made his way to the highest point overlooking Eldamont, a place where the wind was sharp enough to cut through bone, and he sat there alone, watching the lights of the village flicker and fade. Somewhere far beyond the mist, his children were growing up without him, their lives unfolding like pages of a book he would never be allowed to read. And so he sat, a man hollowed out by his own hand, whispering apologies into a wind that would never carry them far enough to be heard. Liam Carter lived out his days on the edge of Eldamont like a ghost clinging to a world that no longer wanted him. He built a small shack from fallen branches and stones at the farthest point from the village, near the cliffs where the wind howled like grieving mothers through the broken trees. No one came to visit him. No one spoke his name unless it was muttered as a warning to children about the price of selfishness. He survived on what little he could forage or barter, with the few coins he sometimes earned doing hard, thankless work for farmers who pitied him more than they trusted him. His hands grew rougher, his back more bent, his once sharp eyes dulled by years of staring at a horizon that never brought the forgiveness he longed for. At night, when the mist rolled in from the river and cloaked the land in a heavy blanket of sorrow, Liam would sit by the dying embers of a fire and whisper into the darkness. He spoke to the children he never named, to the dreams he had killed before they could bloom. He imagined the twins laughing somewhere far away, their faces blurring in his mind as they grew older in his imagination. He clutched the tattered edge of an old blanket Amelia had once sewn, holding it to his chest like a talisman, though it could not shield him from the storms he had unleashed upon his own soul. Amelia never returned to Eldamont, her footsteps carrying her into a new life built on the ashes of the one she had been forced to abandon. Somewhere beyond the hills, in a place where no one knew her sorrow, she began again, not because the pain had lessened, but because survival demanded it. In the evenings, she would sit by the window of a small rented room, her hands idle in her lap, and think of the twins. She had no photographs, no mementos except the tiny cap she had carried from Eldamont, now kept tucked safely beneath her pillow. Some nights she imagined hearing their voices outside her window, the childish shouts and laughter that mothers know instinctively. She would rise quickly, heart pounding, only to find the streets empty, the night silent. Amelia did not remarry. She did not seek companionship. The wound Liam had carved into her heart had healed only in the way that deep wounds do, by hardening into scar tissue that numbed everything it touched. She found work mending clothes for strangers, sewing tiny dresses and shirts she pretended were meant for the twins she would never again hold. In this quiet, invisible way, Amelia honored the lives that had been stolen from her, stitching a thread of love into every fabric she touched, a mother's devotion hidden in the seams of the world. Liam spent countless evenings perched atop the cliff's edge, watching the seasons change with a heavy, aching longing that never left him. Winter cloaked the fields in frost, and he would pull his thin coat tighter around his wasted frame, shivering not just from the cold, but from the memories that refused to die. Spring brought green shoots and new life, but to Liam it only deepened the contrast between what grew and what he had destroyed. Sometimes he saw young families walking along the lower paths, the laughter of children carried up to him by the wind. He would close his eyes and imagine that one of those voices belonged to his son, that one of those bright faces belonged to his daughter, even though he knew it was impossible. He imagined them growing strong, learning to run, to speak, to live without ever knowing the man who had traded them for a sack of money and a fleeting dream of comfort. Guilt clung to him more tightly than any garment, a constant weight that bent his shoulders and bowed his spirit. There were no friends to distract him, no work to fill the empty hours, only the long, slow unraveling of a life that had lost its meaning long before he realized it. As the years passed, Liam's presence became less and less noticed by the people of Eldermont. New children grew up hearing rumors about the hermit on the cliff, but few dared approach him. His hair grew long and tangled, his face lined with regret etched so deeply that no smile could ever soften it again. On the rare occasion he descended into the village for supplies, the shopkeepers would serve him quickly, their eyes averted, eager to send him back to the shadows where he belonged. One bitter evening, as the sun sank into a pool of blood-red clouds, Liam sat on his usual rock overlooking the valley, his hands trembling from age and sorrow. He whispered the same questions into the wind that he had asked 1,000 times before, questions that were carried away into the twilight without ever finding answers. Were they happy? Did they know they were loved, even by a man too broken to show it? Would they ever forgive the father who had sold them for a chance at an easier life? The wind answered only with the rustle of dry leaves and the distant cries of unseen birds. And so Liam remained there, a solitary figure hunched against the gathering darkness, a man whose legacy was written not in triumphs or joys, but in two tiny cries lost forever to the uncaring wind. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.